On the map, it looks like a detail. A break at the far edge of South America, a tip swept by low clouds and gray water. In the history of navigation, however, it is a threshold, the place where the Atlantic and the Pacific stop being names and become a continuous force. Cape Horn is located on a small island, Hornos Island, within the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, and marks the northern edge of the Drake Passage, the ocean corridor that separates South America from Antarctica. That geographical fact matters for a simple reason. For centuries, when global trade needed to connect two oceans without an interoceanic canal, this was the most direct point of passage. Long before the Panama Canal existed, rounding the Cape meant connecting entire economies. The route served to carry goods from the Atlantic to the American Pacific coast, and in reverse, to move products from the Pacific to Europe and the South Atlantic. It was not a romantic crossing. It was pure logistics. Weeks of sailing, full holds, commercial deadlines, maritime insurance, and a single certainty. The price of the shortcut was entering a sea that offered no refuge. The Cape, moreover, did not become important overnight. First, it was a cartographic obsession, the idea of a passage at the southern extreme, at a time when dominant routes passed through straits controlled by empires or contested seas. Over time, the edge became a regular route, and the route a filter. Those who crossed it did not only carry cargo, they carried practical information. Which sails held, which rigging failed, which decisions saved a ship when the wind shifted without warning. The first documented circumnavigation of the Cape is attributed to the Dutch navigators Willem Schouten and Jacob Lemaire in 1616, who named it after the city of Hoorn. The fact is historical, but also functional. From that moment on, the Cape ceased to be a hypothesis and became a real destination for sailors seeking an outlet to the Pacific without passing through restricted routes. However, what turned Cape Horn into legend was not its discovery, but its statistics. Generation after generation, the Cape accumulated losses. More than 800 shipwrecks are associated with the Hornos area, with thousands of sailors dead over the centuries. That number is not a decorative detail. It describes repetition. This is not about an unlucky ship, an imprudent captain, or an exceptional storm. It is about a place where a combination of conditions frequently produces the kind of sea that punishes any mistake and multiplies any failure. Even so, the world kept passing through it. The 19th century, in particular, consolidated Hornos as a commercial artery. There is one example that makes this visible. In 1849, during the California Gold Rush, an extraordinary flow of ships was recorded rounding the Cape to enter the Pacific, bound for San Francisco. It was a demonstration of scale. When the economic incentive was large enough, the most feared route on the planet turned into a highway. Navigation accepted risk as part of the cost. And here lies the core of the story. Cape Horn is not a dangerous point, as if danger were fixed to a specific rock. Danger is a system. In the age of sail, this system demanded a direct physical price. Endless watches on deck, soaked clothing that never dried, frozen hands handling taut lines, the creak of the hull as the ship drops between waves, and the fatigue that turns clumsy what should be precise. But even when sail was replaced by machines and steel, the system did not disappear. The type of failure changed, becoming less dependent on rigging and more dependent on engines, rudder, and structure. But the force that pushes toward error remains the same. That is why the Cape also shaped empires and routes, not only because it connected markets, but because it imposed constraints. What ships were built, what crews were trained, which insurers charged more, which ports of the South Atlantic grew as stopovers, which cargoes were prioritized for value and urgency. The Horn, in practice, was a piece of the global economy that could not be negotiated. The ocean imposed its fee. When the Panama Canal opened an alternative, much of world trade no longer needed to pass through the southern extreme. But the Cape did not switch off. It remained present as a possible route under certain circumstances and, above all, as a cultural reference of navigation. The test that does not depend on human pride, but on climate and sea. And to understand why that test was and remains so harsh, it is not enough to say bad weather. The physics of hell, why the sea becomes lethal at Cape Horn. Cape Horn does not kill by mystery or bad luck. It kills by mechanics. It is a point where large and persistent forces overlap. The atmosphere of the southern hemisphere, the open ocean without obstacles, and a submarine geography that turns energy into violence. When those pieces fit together, the result is not bad weather. It is a sea that can become impracticable even for a well-built and well-commanded ship. The first piece is the dominant wind. Between 40 degrees and 60 degrees south latitude operate the belts of westerly winds, famous for their continuity and for the lack of large continental land masses to slow them down. In sailors' language, they appear as the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and farther south, the screaming 60s. They are not poetic nicknames. They describe bands of atmospheric circulation that can blow for days, with gusts capable of dismasting ships and, above all, with a regularity that does not exist in most enclosed seas. NOAA explains them as a direct product of global circulation and Earth's rotation, combined with the scarcity of land acting as a barrier. Cape Horn lies precisely where these winds already arrive with force. There, in addition, they encounter a corridor between South America and Antarctica, the Drake Passage. That corridor does not channel the wind like a perfect tunnel, but it does mark a region where the atmosphere and the ocean have room to accelerate without interruptions. The real effect for a navigator is simple. The wind is not only strong, it is also persistent. When the wind persists, the sea grows, and it grows in a particular way. Not as a single, isolated wave, but as an entire wave field, with several overlapping wave trains, because the fetch, the distance over which the wind blows without obstacles, can be enormous in the Southern Ocean. The second piece is the current. The Drake Passage not only connects oceans, it is the narrowest point of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a CC, the continuous flow that circles the Antarctic continent. In terms of transport, the ACC moves enormous volumes of water through the Drake, and its scale is sufficient to influence the way wave patterns organize and how oceanic fronts behave. Here a key phenomenon appears. When wind and current push in different directions, or when the current abruptly modifies the surface water speed, waves become steeper. The sea does not need to be higher to become more dangerous. It is enough for it to be more vertical, with shorter distances between crests and a greater tendency to break. A long wave can be ridden. A steep wave breaks and strikes like a moving wall. At Cape Horn, this transition can occur when a front arrives with strong wind over a surface already agitated by intense currents and accumulated swell. The third piece lies beneath the water, the submarine relief. One concrete reason why the swell around the Cape can become brutal is the rapid variation in depth in nearby areas. NASA Earth Observatory describes an abrupt jump in the ocean floor southwest of the Cape, from thousands of meters deep to much shallower depths over just a few kilometers. And this topography helps translate ocean energy into large and, above all, irregular waves, with breaking seas that appear where a ship does not expect them. This leads to another typical feature of Cape Horn, directional chaos. It is not always a single wave train that must be faced. There may be swell from the Pacific, swell from the Atlantic, and local seas raised by the prevailing wind, each with different directions and periods. The result is not a uniform wall, but a deck that moves in 3 dimensions. For a ship, that means impacts from unexpected angles. For a crew, it means working on a surface that never stabilizes. Added to all this are conditions that do not seem spectacular, but that wear down and kill. The water temperature is low for much of the year. Rain and hail are frequent. Visibility can drop suddenly. A vessel may be perfectly positioned on charts and GPS and still become blind for fine maneuvering due to foam, spray, and darkness. And although icebergs are not always present as an immediate threat along the exact line of the Cape, the Drake Passage and nearby latitudes can include drifting ice in certain seasons or routes, especially if bad weather pushes the vessel south. The danger of ice does not need to be constant to be decisive. It is enough for it to appear when fatigue, poor visibility, and heavy seas are already present. If one were to summarize the formula of Cape Horn in operational terms, it is this: persistent wind plus the open ocean, large-scale currents, and abrupt submarine relief generate large, steep, and irregular waves, capable of turning a minor failure into an emergency. That is why so many shipwrecks have accumulated throughout history, and why fear does not disappear with technology. Because modern technology helps you know where you are and what lies ahead, but it does not eliminate the physical work required to survive once the sea is already built. Living to maneuver, the brutal routine of Cape Horn sailing ships. In the age of sail, the passage through the South was not an isolated episode within a long voyage. For weeks, it was a way of life reduced to a single priority: keeping the ship manageable. Everything else, rest, hot food, dry clothing, was subordinated to the need to react quickly to a change in wind, a wave breaking over the deck, or a failure in the rigging. And Cape Horn, because of its climate and sea, turned that priority into an extreme routine. The first element was operational time. A large sailing ship could not push a button to get out of a bad situation. If the wind increased, the response was human labor. Reducing sail, taking in reefs, changing the type of sail, or simply furling and leaving the minimum possible surface to avoid dismasting. A maneuver could take minutes in good weather, but at the Horn, with icy water hitting the face and a slanted deck, those minutes became long and dangerous. The difference between reducing canvas in time or too late was not about comfort. It was about preventing a gust from tearing a sail apart, and with it part of the rigging, leaving the ship without balance. The second piece was the watch system. Sailing in heavy seas worked with shifts that repeated without pause because the ship demanded constant vigilance. While part of the crew worked, the other tried to rest in spaces that in southern latitudes tended to be damp and cold. It was not full rest, it was partial recovery, often in wet clothing and with the sound of waves pounding as background. In period accounts and reconstructions, the image is repeated of narrow bunks, bodies shivering from cold and damp, and sleep interrupted by urgent maneuvers. Some historical compilations describe that rest as shivering with wet and cold, with water moving beneath the accommodation floor, which portrays a concrete problem. The cold was not a moment. It was the normal state. The third element was technical discipline. In heavy seas, the sailing ship does not merely move forward, it fights to maintain a safe orientation to the waves. A wave taken on the beam can cause a sudden heel, sweep the deck, and tear men or equipment away. For that reason, storm navigation included tactics that remain valid in principle today, although with different vessels. Heaving to, running with the storm, keeping the ship a point, freer to preserve speed and control, avoiding loss of way, and choosing how much canvas to keep in order not to lose steerage. In professional maritime literature and naval practice manuals, this idea is emphasized. Not to hug the wind too much when it is bad, because losing speed is losing rudder authority. That balance was especially delicate on the westward passage, because the prevailing southern winds blow from the west most of the time. This forced sailing ships to beat to windward or tack for days, with turns that near the Cape could turn into a roulette. If a tack went wrong, the ship was left exposed with the sea striking from a destructive angle, and could also be pushed leeward, straight toward coasts and islands where the breakers show no mercy. Cape Horn's reputation was built not only on high waves, it was built on this chain of causes: difficult maneuvering plus little margin plus an environment without shelter. On deck, the work had immediate physical risks. A taut rope could snap and strike like a bar. A spar could move violently. A sail flapping in a storm is not fabric. It's a surface that pulls with tons of force. That's why the trade demanded coordination and quick obedience. Fear was not imaginary. It was in specific tasks. Climbing the rigging with the ship tossing, securing canvas with numb hands, working in low light, and doing it while the wind tries to rip you off. Accumulated fatigue was the invisible enemy because it turns a familiar task into a clumsy one. Added to this were the limitations of information. Before modern meteorology, a captain relied on observation, a barometer, and experience. The good window could be an illusion. A front could enter quickly, change direction, and stiffen the sea in hours. NASA, describing the Horn as a sailor's nightmare, emphasizes that a mix of strong winds, large waves, currents, and sometimes ice is part of the danger package that historically made the area a major test. The psychological consequence was direct. Each day resembled the previous in its demands, but not in its risks. In a port, the body rests. In the Horn, the body merely endures. That difference explains why the passage became a professional symbol. Among sailors exists the idea of the Cape Horner, the one who rounded it and recounts it, and even later traditions, like the right to wear a ring according to the side past, arise from that notion. Surviving the Cape was proof of skill, not theatrical bravery. However, even with skill, the Cape exacted its price. When wear mixes with a material failure, like a mast giving way, a damaged rudder, a leak, or a pump that doesn't reach, the Southern Sea leaves no time for improvisation. And there appears the darkest chapter of this story. The ships that never returned, those that were dismasted and drifted, those that crashed against wind-swept coasts or sank without a trace, forming that long record of disasters that made the Cape an underwater graveyard. The Southern Cemetery, shipwrecks, losses, and the cost of connecting the world. The fame of Cape Horn was not built by a single memorable storm, but by an accumulation of absences. Ships that left port with cargo, crew, and a clear destination, and later became an administrative silence. Did not return, nothing more was known, presumed lost. In that phrase lies the specific terror of the South. It is not only the danger of sinking, it is the possibility of disappearing in an area so vast, so harsh, and so remote that not even a complete account of the ending remains. The lists of shipwrecks associated with Hornos, more than 800 according to widely cited historical counts, function as statistics, but behind the figure, there are repeating patterns. The first is the storm that does not break the ship instantly, but degrades it. Sustained wind, cross seas, water entering the deck, rigging working as if it were an instrument going out of tune and stretched to the limit. In that state, a minor failure like a torn sail, a jammed pulley, or a damaged spar ceases to be an inconvenience. It becomes a loss of control. And in Hornos, losing control does not mean drifting a few degrees. It means being pushed for hours leeward toward coasts and islands where the surf turns the approach into a trap. The second pattern is structural failure. On sailing ships, the loss of a mast or the partial collapse of the rigging not only removes propulsion, it removes stability. A dismasted ship is exposed to side waves, hitting the hull at an angle it is not designed for. In the open sea, that exposure accelerates damage, opens leaks, and exhausts pumps and crew. The very scientific description of Hornos as a sailor's nightmare insists on the full package. Strong winds, large waves, currents, and an underwater topography that can make the sea more violent and uneven. Among the cases that concentrate the drama of this region is that of the Spanish ship San Telmo, lost in 1819 during a storm in the southern area, with hundreds on board, with no possible rescue. What makes that episode terrifying is not only the number of dead, it was a large ship with a military crew, at a time when navigation already knew the danger of the Cape. Still, the Southern Force system could impose an irreversible sequence: damage, loss of control, disappearance. Another typical feature of extreme Southern tragedies is the lack of a second scenario. In more trafficked seas, a damaged vessel can seek a nearby port, be towed, or at least be within communication and aid distance. In the pre-radio era, help depended on coincidences, crossing paths with another ship at the right moment, or managing to stay afloat long enough to reach land. And reaching land was not synonymous with salvation. Southern islands and coasts could offer a beach, yes, but they could also offer cold, constant wind and minimal resources. Surviving the sinking did not guarantee survival afterward. The concentration of wrecks and tragedies in the south was also linked to a geography of confinement. The Fuegian archipelago, full of complex channels, strong currents and rocks, multiplied accidents when trying to seek shelter, repair, or avoid the worst sea. In that area, the risk was not only the open ocean waves, but also navigational errors under poor visibility and with wind pushing leeward toward the coast. In regional compilations of shipwrecks, there are episodes that, although they do not occur at the exact tip of the Cape, share the same logic of the far south: isolation, harsh climate, and little room for maneuver, as in the case of the ship Monte Cervantes in Fuegian waters. These disasters were not a minor side effect. They influenced how ships were built and how businesses were calculated. The Cape acted as an invisible tax on global trade. It raised insurance premiums, made trained crews more expensive, forced the design of robust hulls, and extended travel times because many voyages had to wait for a manageable weather window. The consequence was political and economic. Routes, ports, and fleets were organized around that necessity. In the 19th century, when trade accelerated, the Hornos became part of a network that fed national economies and imperial ambitions, precisely because it allowed connecting the Atlantic and Pacific without depending on the passages controlled by rivals. But that usefulness had a limit: the human cost. In maritime records, the Hornos was the place where work stopped being work and resembled prolonged resistance. Each shipwreck reinforced the lesson of a truth: the South is not dominated. It is crossed with caution, and sometimes not even that is enough. That truth, accumulated over centuries, explains why the Cape maintained its aura even as the technological world changed. After the canal, modern technology, the same sea. When the Panama Canal was inaugurated, the practical map of maritime trade changed irreversibly. What had previously been a geographic necessity, linking the Atlantic and Pacific by rounding the southern tip, gained a shorter, more predictable, and above all, more controllable alternative. A huge portion of international merchant traffic no longer depended on Cape Horn. This reduced the number of ships exposed to the southern tax. Fewer weeks in harsh latitudes, less wear on hulls and crews, fewer chances of being caught in successive storms. But the canal did not change the ocean. It changed the economic obligation of facing it. Cape Horn remained a real point within a real system. Intense prevailing winds, open sea with a long fetch, and a region, the Drake Passage, where water and air circulate with exceptional energy. That is why, even in the 21st century, no serious navigator speaks of Cape Horn as a solved problem. It is spoken of as one speaks of a polar front. It is managed, respected, avoided when possible, and when it must be crossed, it is done with margin and preparation. The modern difference is not fear, it is information. In the age of sail, the captain read the weather changes through signals: barometric pressure, clouds, sea behavior. Today, a ship can consult weather models, receive satellite images, measure wind and pressure with high-precision instruments, and anticipate the arrival of a system hours or days in advance. That advantage, however, does not equate to total control. In the South, forecasts improve routing decisions, for example, choosing a less severe weather window, but they do not eliminate the possibility that a front accelerates, changes shape, or intensifies beyond expectations. Operationally, forecasting reduces chance. It does not eliminate punishment when it comes. It also changed where I am. With GPS and electronic navigation systems, position is no longer a daily uncertainty. In low visibility areas, that precision prevents groundings from estimation errors and reduces the risk of unknowingly approaching coasts or islets. However, at Cape Horn, many problems do not arise from not knowing where you are, but from not being able to do what you want, even when you know where you are. A ship can be exactly on course and still have to slow down, change plans, or heave to, because the sea has made a maneuver impracticable. The third change is structural, materials and power. Modern hulls resist better than the wood of the great sailing ships, and engines allow maintaining speed without relying on wind angle. But this improvement also introduces its own vulnerabilities. In a severe storm, the engine and transmission suffer from propeller slamming out of the water, air ingestion, vibration stress, and sustained demands. The rudder works under enormous loads when the ship runs with a following sea, and requires continuous corrections to avoid broaching. Electronics and power are critical points. An electrical failure in bad weather is not an inconvenience. It is losing navigation, pumps, communications, or instruments just when they are most needed. The cold remains the same enemy, and not just because of discomfort. Hypothermia, loss of manual dexterity, and accelerated fatigue remain risk factors because they affect repair capability. At Cape Horn, fixing something rarely happens in a dry workshop. It occurs with the ship shaking, constant spray, slippery tools, and a reduced margin for error. A simple harbor task like changing a component, securing a cable, or checking a pump in heavy seas becomes a slow operation, and time in the south is an expensive currency. Ice, although not a daily danger at every crossing, remains a strategic possibility. On routes that sink too far south due to weather evasion or tactical decision, ice reports and visual monitoring become relevant. In poor visibility conditions, a low piece of ice, difficult to detect by radar depending on its size and shape, can represent a serious impact for a hull, especially in an area where external assistance may take time. That is why Cape Horn retains a particular place in contemporary navigation. It is no longer the mandatory highway of global trade, but it remains a sea test for those who decide to cross it. This is clearly seen in high seas sport sailing. Ocean races and circumnavigations maintain the passage through southern latitudes because there are strong winds that give speed and because the historical route has prestige. Modern calculation is cold. The risk is accepted because the goal demands it, but it is managed with meteorology, planning, and emergency protocols. Even so, when conditions harden, reality returns to the old ways. The sea sets the pace, and the crew works to keep the ship a ship and not an object adrift. This persistence explains why the Hornos still instills fear, even with satellites. The satellite can show the system. It cannot lower the sea. The radio can call for help. It cannot guarantee someone will arrive. The GPS can fix the position. It cannot prevent a wave from breaking where it breaks. And in a place with centuries of shipwrecks, that is the fact that spans eras and technologies, the far south has not become less real, only less mandatory. On the nautical chart, the Cape is a coordinate. In practice, it remains a meteorological and human frontier, and every modern crossing confirms the same operational idea learned by sailing mariners. At Hornos, the difference between passing and getting lost is rarely courage. Almost always it is a time window, a timely decision, and a ship that withstands one more blow.